Very good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Salivonomics, a free webinar series that we will be conducting with pioneers in the field of saliva diagnostics from all over the world. I welcome Dr. Paul D. Slowey, who is the founder and CEO of Oasis Diagnostics. Dr. Paul, thank you so much for being here. And we can't start this program without, understanding saliva from you. But before that, I would appreciate if you'd like to tell about your journey. And I think it's almost 30 years you are in this field. So it will be very fascinating to hear a brief about your journey with saliva.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be on the webinar. This is going to be a wonderful series. We got some fantastic speakers lined up. Yeah, as you mentioned, my background goes back, I think it's 29 plus years. It's not quite 30, but I started life in what I call the two pioneering companies in the business. Saliva Diagnostic Systems was based in Vancouver, Washington. They started probably in about 1990, and then Epitope on the other side of the river in Beaverton, Oregon, was the other pioneer. So I worked for both of those. I was chief operating officer for Saliva Diagnostic Systems that developed the QuantiSal oral fluid drug test, which is drug collection device, which is probably the mainstay of the drug testing market right now. And then I moved to OraSure. I was director of international business for OraSure for 2 years. During that time, I licensed the peptides for the OraQuick HIV test, which is now an oral HIV test that you can purchase in a pharmacy. So you can literally go down to your local pharmacy, purchase a test kit that will tell you in 20 minutes whether you have HIV with 99.7% accuracy. During that time, I managed to sell the very first order for the company of about 250,000 units to the CDC for about 15 different African countries. So after that, I founded my own company, Oasis Diagnostics, 23 years ago. And in that time, we've developed about 10 different technologies for oral fluid collection for everything from DNA, RNA, proteins, collection from babies, animals, etc. We can talk a little bit about that later. But I'm also co-chair of the Alzheimer's Association Business Consortium, which is an organization under the Alzheimer's Association umbrella that comprises about 50 different companies, small to medium, that are developing either therapeutics, devices, or diagnostics for Alzheimer's disease. Not necessarily saliva particularly, but saliva does play quite a big role. I'm also the co-chair of a specific working group within the Alzheimer's Association called the Saliva Working Group for Alzheimer's Disease Biomarkers. And within that group, that is literally 50 people, researchers around the world that are actually focused on using saliva for Alzheimer's diagnosis. Now, the company Oasis is based in Portland, Oregon, and we have about 6,500 square feet of manufacturing space at Oasis right now. I think that's probably a decent introduction. My background is a PhD organic chemist, by the way, with 3 years postdoctoral fellowship in Victoria, British Columbia for 2 years, and then St. John's, Newfoundland, both in Canada.
Amazing. I think our audience is already mesmerized by the kind of experience you have told us today. And I think this series is more about understanding saliva closely and listening to pioneers like you and understanding the world, how the world has been into the field and certain things that we still don't know. And I think we have a lot of good speakers coming up in the series. And let's see, I think it would be a very interesting one to talk about saliva all the time.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, Dr. Paul. So let's start with the very basics. So as we know, we have often heard that saliva is also called as the mirror of the body. So a basic question that hits my mind is that when we talk about saliva, is such a powerful diagnostic fluid. But can you enlighten us in a way like how saliva, I mean, what gives the unique potential or unique diagnostic edge to saliva over other biofluids, for example, urine or sweat or blood? So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In my opinion, a lot of the things that attracted me to this particular area were, first of all, it was a comment by Dr. Lawrence Tabak, who eventually ended up, I believe he became director of the NIH, or at least deputy director. He was also director of the National Institute for Dental and Craniofacial Research for a lot of years. He was the guy that coined, a mirror of the body. And it's around about that time that I started to show a real strong interest in saliva. But I think, if you look at it kind of in the plain light of day, it's a non-invasive specimen. That's kind of one of the key things. Obviously, most things are present in saliva. Sometimes they're present in a lot lower quantities than you would find in other bodily fluids. But we can talk about that later. And that's, I think the change more recently is that new technologies are available that can go down to much, much lower levels, which makes saliva an even more attractive biofluid. It's easy to transport. It's easy to dispose of. Sometimes there's religious and cultural reasons why certain populations will not give a blood sample. I know certain African cultures do not like giving the blood sample, but they'll happily give a saliva sample. Jehovah's Witnesses in the US won't give a blood sample. They won't undergo blood transfusion or anything like that. And sometimes it's actually a better indicator of disease. Once upon a time, we had a relationship with Siemens, the very large company. And at that time, they had a biomarker that actually appeared in the gut and came up into the saliva, but never appeared in the bloodstream. So in that case, that was a specific test that required a saliva sample. But, there's the other thing I think is very important is that it can be used for home-based collections. It takes the necessity out of having to draw blood because a person at home is not going to draw their own blood, but they're quite happy to collect their own saliva specimen and send it to a lab.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, for that wonderful, comprehensive answer. So when it comes to biomarkers, the molecules, whatever, as we all know that we can see things, what we see in blood, we can see in saliva as well. So, but primarily, what would be, if I just ask you to list certain areas which are more promising in terms of disease diagnostics with saliva?
That's a difficult question because there are so many growth areas. If you recall during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA approved 30 real-time PCR tests for saliva. They never did approve a rapid antigen test or anything like that, but they did, manage to get 30, products through the EUA in order for a lot of testing to take place. But that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg. There were things like concussion, PTSD, biological age in saliva, human papillomavirus. You've got all sorts of things. You can do just about anything with saliva, and there's a lot of work going on right now. I think lateral flow chemistry is come into its own as well. There's a company called Oral Genome, and hopefully we'll get them on this webinar series at some point in time, that has a 7-parameter dental test that looks at things like dental caries, periodontitis, nitrous oxide, that risk factor for diabetes, and 3 other parameters, all in one specimen, all done in a dental office using saliva. And, they get reimbursed for that particular test. So it's the market is booming in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not sure. Does that answer your questions? But you asked me which are the 2 growth areas. If I had to categorize 2 of the biggest growth areas, I would say oncology, cancer particularly. There are applications out there, and with one of our devices, we can diagnose lung cancer with 1 drop of saliva using technology developed at UCLA by Dr. David Wong's lab. But there are other technologies that can do the same thing. There is also Alzheimer's disease. As I mentioned, I'm co-chair of a working group, but there's a lot of people working in this area. And saliva, there are a lot of blood-based biomarkers that just went through FDA approval. I think the next sequence will be, we started with CSF, then we went to blood. I think saliva is the next frontier, if you like.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Dr. Paul, another interesting question is always about when we speak to people who are kind of little non-believer of saliva. It comes up with, like, of course, like any field, we also have a lot of challenges in this field, particularly when we are trying to take convert data of a saliva test or a saliva research into a more authentic or translatable diagnostic data.
Mhm.
So, um, what do you think are the most in terms of technicalities? My question is, like, what are the most challenging hurdles that one need to face while working with saliva, and probably if there are any tips that you can give to actually solve or overcome these kind of challenges.
So I think there are a couple of things. In the 30 years since I've been in this business, it was always a fairly uphill push. And one of the reasons it was an uphill push was that the technologies didn't exist to find the biomarkers in saliva. I mentioned earlier that either sometimes in saliva, and in fact, a lot of the time, the biomarkers are present in much lower concentrations. Therefore, you need a much more sensitive technology to identify those biomarkers. Nowadays, I think things like fluorescent lateral flow, which can go down to low picogram per mil levels, mass spectrometry, next generation sequencing, all these technologies allow you to identify biomarkers in saliva. Just to give you an example, I think if I remember rightly, the HIV antibody test that was developed by OraQuick, I think the antibody levels are 1/1500th present that compared to blood, but we are still able to get 99.7% sensitivity on the device. If you talk about Oasis and how we approached it as a company, we actually kind of went about it the other way around in order to develop multiple technologies that could be used for everything. So, I don't say that we can detect anything in saliva, but we can pretty much collect most things in saliva. So what I mean by that is, we can detect RNA in saliva. We can detect DNA for consumer genetics. We can collect proteins for proteomics, like Alzheimer's disease. We can collect cell-free samples, so we can actually remove the cells and the large genomic DNA that's present in a whole saliva specimen. We can remove the mucins, which cause a lot of the downstream interference, and then we can get a cell-free sample that can be used to diagnose lung cancer. We can look at microRNAs in those specimens. We can look at exosomes, and then we also decided that we'd have devices that are for children, for intubated babies, for adults, for geriatrics, and also from the very smallest animal to the very largest animal. So we tried to cover the gamut, and I don't think anybody can do that, but there is a lot of tools that can be adapted for to get you that sensitivity you need.
Yeah, I think those are the 2 points which I would take up, like as you spoke, sensitivity and specificity. When it comes to any kind of diagnostics, that would be those two parameters are most important. I think, particularly when researchers are trying to develop, as well as like you mentioned about, collecting these biomarkers in a most pure form, or a adequate concentration is the first challenge which I understand. So
Yeah,
I
and there is one more thing that we need to think about, and that is the correlation between blood and saliva. The correlation is not always there. In the case of glucose, it's very difficult to get a good correlation. So typically, we would use a surrogate biomarker, such as glycated hemoglobin or something like that, or glycated albumin, something that's a surrogate biomarker that looks very similar. And most cases, you're going to get correlation, but not always. So we have to think about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for enlightening us on that. So, Dr. Paul, from cancer to metabolic disorders, so everywhere we can, I mean to say, saliva seems to speak many biological stories in this whole arena of diagnostics or detection. So, how close are we in at least at present moment, do you think we could develop a kind of a single saliva test maybe in the future, which might be which might help us in screening multiple diseases, just like how we could when microarrays came up, we could detect several thousand genes in one shot. So is there something that we could do with saliva as well?
Well, I think yes and no. And I have to say that with a caveat because, it's saliva. Saliva is great, and there's very big pockets of areas where it's utilized in very important multiplex systems. In the drug testing world, for instance, there are many drug tests that use saliva to collect drugs, and they can do multiple drugs at the same time. I think the same is going to be true in the cancer area, where we can do multiple genes at the same time. We can do multiple RNAs. In answer to your question as to whether one drop of blood saliva is going to be able to diagnose everything, I think you have to go back to the physician's office where I have my annual checkup coming up, but then I'm sure they're going to do a battery of blood tests for me. What they're going to do on that blood test is, my calcium, my sodium, my platelets, all this sort of stuff. Not all of those things. There aren't any diagnostic tests for saliva for those downstream tests. So until there are downstream tests where we can collect the saliva sample, so I think the market is still virgin in terms of the companies that are out there developing tests. And I tend to encourage my competitors as well as ourselves, to think outside the box and to try and develop new tests that cover all of these areas, so that one day in the future we might be able to use saliva for everything. But I don't see it in the next few years, just because of what I mentioned. Although, as I said, in specific areas, maybe Alzheimer's, we're going to be able to diagnose Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, FTD, other neurological diseases. So, cancer, I think we can do the same thing. So it's going to be kind of disease specific until we have many other tests that are out there that can be used. And more companies getting in the area. So I welcome other companies to actually develop new tests that we can use to help people.
Yeah, I think that point. Thank you for answering my weird question first of all. But what you said is very important. Like I think when it is business, we all do different kinds of things and we have competitors. But when we see a vision together to do something about the society, bring a real change. So as you said, like you encourage your competitors also to think out of the box. So I think it's time that we come, just forgetting that what we are doing in terms of business, whether you are my competitor or not. But I think it's time that we should come up as a consortium or kind of a group where we churn ideas, so that instead of being a competitor, we might turn to be collaborator as well. So that makes...
if I may, I just actually in the last 3 months talked to a lot of my competitors, my customers, other saliva companies in the business, and promoted the idea of having a consortium, because there is such a thing in the blood world. There isn't such a thing in the saliva world. And, there are a couple of large companies in the saliva world, but not huge companies. OraSure's 267 million in revenue last year. That's a big number, but it's not, it's not billions of dollars like Thermo Fisher or something like that. So by forming a consortium that are all working towards the same goal, having, common goals, even though we're competitive, we each work together to develop our own tests. But then I think that precipitates more companies to get into the business, more tests will come out, and then eventually that one drop of saliva for everything will become a reality,
Yeah, hopefully.
That's the hope anyway.
Yeah. Well, we often say that when it comes to biomarkers for disease detection, so biomarkers speaks a lot. So could you share any moment of your experience when you are more into the research and development part, particularly Oasis does a lot of research. I know that, and a lot of publications you have with different people. So, is there any such specific moment or research discovery that actually changed your thought, or you started thinking a little different way in terms of diagnosing diseases and working with saliva?
Hmm. Well, I have one example, which it's not truly saliva. The experience was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and at the time, we maybe had 5 technologies for saliva, and I was meeting with the head of the cervical cancer screening program for the whole of Brazil, and I laid my tools out on the desk, and I said, "What do you think, doctor?" And he picked up one of the devices, and he says, "I really like this, but I don't want to use it for saliva." So I said, "Okay, what do you want to use it for?" And he said, "Well, I want to use it for cervical vaginal specimen collection. I would like to send this into the Amazon. I work on a human papillomavirus project, and it's very difficult to get women to collect specimens. They have to come in, from the Amazon to actually get tested in Sao Paulo. If we had some means of collecting, a specimen from them at the point of collection." So I said, I have no idea if it'll work, doctor, but I sent them some devices, and lo and behold, they were able to collect twice as much DNA from the vagina as for colposcopy, and it just basically capped it, sent it to the lab. The ladies took 5 minutes to collect. There was no discomfort. So that was the biggest surprise in the whole of my life, actually, because this one of our saliva collectors became a cervical vaginal specimen collection device for home-based collection, which is
Amazing.
very,
That's
very
amazing.
interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. So, with the pandemic in place, and we have seen a lot when it came to home-based tests, particularly saliva. I always say that COVID was not a good thing for anybody,
Mhm.
but I think for saliva, it became a little game changer. People started looking more into the biofluid. So, what do you think? Like, how we can build more confidence in among clinicians, even patients, and also people who would like to. I mean, straight away, investors. How can we bring more attraction towards saliva? What would be those good steps that we should actually think of? Not only think, but start implementing.
My
So that.
my good friend David Wong would say that we need credentialing, and what he means by that is we need more tests that are approved through the FDA. OraQuick was approved through the FDA. 23andMe got their products through the FDA. Ancestry.com. We collect a lot of saliva for those types of applications, but so far, there are no cancer tests approved by the FDA. We'd have to go through quite a bit of rigor to actually get the products approved. However, we know that they work. It's just a case of actually having the product, taking it to the FDA, asking the FDA what's going to be required in terms of clinical trials to get that product approved, and then actually go through the process and get it approved. And that's not it's not a cheap process. I was going to say it's not cost effective. It's very expensive to do that. So especially if you're talking about a saliva test for cancer, for instance, that's what would be called a PMA, pre-market application, rather than a 510K, which is where you compare your device to a device that's already approved and on the market. So that requires a lot of money. So the companies would need investment backing, and probably most of the companies in the saliva world are relatively small at this point.
Yeah.
We've worked with Quest and LabCorp before. Maybe a relationship like that where you work with a Quest or LabCorp that have huge resources that can actually either run the test in a CLIA laboratory without an FDA approval, which I'm not sure you're familiar with that, but in the United States, they have a lot of laboratories that are accredited under what's called CLIA. CLIA stands for the Clinical Laboratory Implementation Act of 1988. And these labs, they have to have some tests in their portfolio that are FDA approved, but providing that they're completely validated and they're accredited, they're allowed to run tests, and they call them lab developed tests. So the tests are developed in the laboratory to high standards, but they don't go through an FDA approval. So the cost for doing that is much less than actually going through an FDA approval, in which case probably 90% of the tests on the US market don't go through an FDA approval. They go through a clear approval.
Yeah. All right. Okay. That's interesting. That is very interesting point that you mentioned. So I'll just ask you one question out of context, because I keep talking about saliva. As you know, I'm very enthusiastic about it, and I try to talk about it to even people in terms of very veteran scientists or doctors. One thing I have come across, honestly, I would say that that many people have. I feel that they have a mindset resistance. So, like, suppose, like we talked about saliva diagnostics for cancer, or we talk about, say, you can diagnose. I mean, you can check some biomarkers for early diagnosis of cancer, or even checking the metastatic potential of any any pre-malignant lesion that way. So what I have seen mostly is that, oh no, saliva, it doesn't work. I mean, it's just that in the air. So my question to you is maybe like, how could we bring a shift to this mindset? What?
Well, I think I don't want to categorize people, but I think the older generation, my generation, are more averse to change than the younger generation. Certainly the younger generation gets it. You talk to the younger generation and they would, use it at a heartbeat. There's quite an interesting home-based market starting to develop where saliva, is actually collected, and a lot of the young entrepreneurs now are looking at saliva. There's a company called Ellie Health that just developed a cortisol test that you probably come across them. Very interesting technology, and very young people that are developing it, so they're obviously immersed in saliva. And I'm connected with several other companies that are doing very similar things and very innovative as well, but they tend to be on the young side. Dr. Saw from Oral Genome. I don't know how old she is, but she's very young. She's not old like I am. So I think there is just a slight. I mean, I obviously we kind of categorize everybody like that, but I think there is definitely the older generation are used to blood, and that's what they've always been used to. So they always believe that blood is better than saliva, and they would have to see real evidence before they're going to change their mind.
Absolutely. Thank you for answering that.
But that's why we host saliva symposia around the world, right?
Absolutely.
So we try to spread the message, and we bring commercial partners, we bring the researchers together to try and formulate new products that are likely to come through in the future, and to promote the application of saliva, in response to blood and urine and other bodily fluids.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Paul, if we meet in 2035 again, 2035, so what would you hope would have changed in the field of saliva diagnostics and in terms of what saliva is saying to all of us?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of areas I talked about already, so I won't mention them too much again. But Alzheimer's and cancer, I think, are probably the two key. But there's two areas that I would really like to see switch to saliva. The first one is the newborn screening market. In the United States, every child that's born undergoes newborn screening. In that particular process, they take a heel prick from the baby. So they prick the baby's heel, and the baby starts crying its eyes out. The parents are sitting watching, and they hate it because they don't like to see their baby crying. So at some point in the future, I'd like to see saliva overtake blood for that particular specimen. They use a dry blood spot. They send that dry blood spot to the lab, and they elute the dry blood spot off the paper, and they can do all sorts with that. But you know what? We can do the same thing with saliva. We can do dry saliva in the future. So I think that's coming soon, and I think you'll see that will probably. I don't know how long it's going to take because a lot of these companies are entrenched. But that's the first area. The second area is the veterinary market. Our dogs and pets are very dogs, cats, and any other pets are all dear to our hearts, and we don't like to see our. I had 3 cats, and I hated to see them suffer. One of them lived to 21 and a half years old, so he was a very old cat. Sir Nigel, his name was. But veterinary testing does not do a lot of saliva. There are some companies that are in that market already. DNA my dog is one, Embark. Hemopet. There's several companies that are doing that type of testing right now, but it's not widespread. I think we need to, utilize the fact that maybe it's just a knowledge thing. They're not aware of the possibility that you can collect saliva and you can test for any of these different diseases from saliva using an array of different tools that are out there. So I think they're 2 of the areas that I would like to see that have kind of been transformed in 2035.
Great. So I think, Dr. Paul, thank you so much for giving all your insights today. And if I would request, I will make one last request for this particular session, is that if you could highlight the list of saliva summits that's coming up all over the world in 2026, just to give a exciting area to all our listeners, and people then understand that it's not only 1 or 2% talking about it, it's the entire world is being enthusiastic, and a lot of people are putting their hard work to bring saliva up and explore this fantastic biofluid. So yeah.
Right. So I think probably the first one is going to be in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The second one will probably be in Europe. It's not organized by myself. It's organized by a friend of mine called Toon Lichtenberg from ACTA in the Netherlands. It's actually in a place called Egmond aan Zee, which is a nice little place on the seaside with a lighthouse. I've been there. It's only a triennial meeting, so it only happens every 3 years. So the next one after 26 will be 29. So yeah, it's a very good meeting. It's a joint scientific and commercial meeting, so you can have an exhibit there if you want. My meetings are very similar as well. The 2026 North American Saliva Symposium, we're still working on the venue for that. That'll probably be towards the end of the year, third quarter. And then you and I are organizing SALSI, of course, in December 2026 in Bangalore, I hope, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's all that I know of, but that doesn't mean to say that something else might not come up at the last minute.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. All right. I hope everybody enjoyed this conversation. And though we say that this is a webinar, but I think it's more about how we understand saliva from pioneers like Dr. Paul. And stay tuned, and we will have a lot of fantastic people coming up and talking about their work, and I'm sure it will blow your mind when it comes to understanding saliva and see how impactful it is and how people are actually working. And it's not just inside the lab anymore, it's already in the market, and many people are taking advantage of it. So thank you once again, Dr. Paul, for your wholehearted support, because this series wouldn't have been possible without your support. And thank you so much for everything.
Well, thank you. I mean, you are the heart behind all of this, and your inspiration is wonderful. I love working on these particular types of project with you.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Stay tuned and don't miss any talk of this series which is coming up, and I'll keep announcing. So you can follow me on LinkedIn, you can follow Dr. Paul on LinkedIn. We are very active, and we talk about mostly all the time about saliva. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Gargi.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.